we really want to be eating good quality food. And I'm just not an absolutist. I'm not going to say you can never have meat. You can never have this, only eat this, because it sells books, it sells, clicks, whatever, but it's not realistic. And we have the ability to look at people on an individual basis and say, well, based on your labs, on your history, on your genetics, this probably is going to get us in the ballpark where this is going to probably be best for you. And what's best for you may not be what's best for me.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Orthopreneurs Podcast. Today's a live version. I'm coming to you here from Charlotte, North Carolina with my friend Dr. Jeff Galvin. Jeff Galvin. I know him as Jeff, but you may have to know him as Jeffrey. But you may have seen our podcast episode from a little while back where you can learn more about his background, emergency medicine doctor, trauma doc, he was in the Air Force. There's a great story behind all of that you should go look at. But once we posted your podcast episode, we got some of the most feedback of any episode we've ever done with people asking a ton of questions. Now, surprise, orthodontists like to deep dive into things like nutrition, fitness, allergies, supplements, and all that sort of stuff. And so there's two things you should know. Number one, I came here with my wife. She was here for 2 full days. I was here for 1 for a particularly different reason that I'm not going to get into now, just because I'd done some other testing that made it so that I could do 2 really hard workouts in 1 day, which is really good. But my point is, we're going to do a follow-up episode of all the things I recorded while I went through this. So I'm not going to go through all the things we did over a day or 2 here at Vitality. You'll get more of that later because it's really amazing what you go through. But what I did want to talk to everybody about today are the kind of conversations that you're all asking me, that I'm asking him while we're driving in the car. And before you get your integrated health blueprint, which you give at the end of everything, which is really truly a blueprint on how to lose weight, how to feel better, how to think better, how to live longer, how to have better quality of life, that's really individualized for each individual. We'll get there when I finally get there. So that's not the goal of today. The goal of today is to really have somebody who's really an expert in physiology, nutrition, and all those other things to answer some of the questions that you've been asking, and also dispel some myths and help you better understand. Even if you're never going to end up in this space right here in Vitality, you're reading a lot of books, you're learning a lot of things, and one book says, avoid grains forever. The other one says, only eat grains, or eat only organs, or eat only meat. And when you have an opportunity to have a friend that you trust, somebody who's really knowledgeable, to ask them questions over a 2 or 3 day period, that's what I want to do with you today. So I want to hop in right away if it's okay.
Sure.
Let's talk about cholesterol, because I'm going to tell you what I learned and what I thought, and then I'll let you talk a little bit about it.
Sure.
So I was always raised with the idea that, grandma or grandpa had high cholesterol, and so stay away from red meat, stay away from cheese, stay away from milk, and even any animal protein can increase your cholesterol levels a little bit. And that was where cholesterol really came from. And talking to you, I learned that the science doesn't really sort of defend the fact that if you have high cholesterol, you should avoid, red meat and stuff like that. And before you answer, I want to add 2 more things I just remembered. Number one, I personally have no financial interest whatsoever in Vitality in any way, shape, or form. I get no commissions or kickbacks or anything from Jeff. We all have friends who do things, and many of which we don't want to tell anybody about. And then we have friends who really, I think, are a great resource for those around us. So I wanted to get that right away off the bat to make it clear that I have no financial interest whatsoever in anything you do. And number 2, this is a guy who does not, as you'll learn, does not believe in any one model. He's not going to tell you, and you'll understand why as we get into genetics and stuff later on, how there is no one right way. He's not a keto guy, right? He's not a Whole30 guy. He's not an avoid sweets kind of guy. He's a pragmatic, based on science, approach towards things. So I want to get that out of the way up front. So when we start talking about cholesterol, because what you're about to talk about is going to blow people's minds, I don't want them to think like, oh, he's all about, like the organ meat dude. I forget his name.
The liver guy.
The liver guy,
Yeah.
the liver king.
Liver king.
Right, whatever his name is, who's organs, right? We're going to get into a whole bunch of stuff. So let's start with cholesterol, right? So talk to everybody out there about, let's take me, for instance, right? I've been referred to very eloquently by Jeff as overfat. It's great.
Or under lean.
I came up with hypolean. I like that. But I'm over fat. If you look at me, I have a little bit more belly than I should. I have a little bit more visceral fat than I should, and we'll get into that in a minute. How about we learn that? But I'm not technically, you wouldn't be somebody you'd look at and go, wow, his cholesterol is through the ceiling. You should be really worried about this guy. I have no family history of heart disease of any kind, no strokes, no MIs, no nothing on either side of the family. But I certainly am carrying more fat around my midsection than I should at age 55. And my blood sugar, my A1C1, isn't diabetic by any stretch of the imagination, but we're starting to creep up there a little bit. We're starting to get, hey, maybe I want to intervene with this a little bit and be smart about this. And, everything about me is saying this is a relatively healthy guy, but we're certainly seeing some things here that if we don't address them is going to lead us towards cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other things. And so one of the things we talked about was cholesterol. So I'll let you take it from here.
So we call those like little cracks in the foundation, right?
Right.
Deal with them now, they never become a problem. But if we just ignore it, 10 years from now, we got a problem.
Right.
So cholesterol, and I think one of the things about cholesterol is that we've demonized it for a long time, like it's this horrible thing. Well, we need it, absolutely. It's in every one of our cell membranes, every one of our cells. It's a vital, vital component. The thing that we probably have gotten wrong is that this idea that dietary cholesterol really has that big effect on
the stuff we take into our bodies.
Right. And over the years, these, instead of tacitly acknowledging this, subtle things have happened. Like right now, in Canada for a while, but now in the US, there is no real recommendation for dietary cholesterol. It's disappeared.
Right. He asked me to look it up on the web. What does it say on the web when you look up dietary cholesterol? And it's at 300.
From the American Heart Association, there is really any sort of RDA, and the Canadians got rid of it a while ago. And that's because, while dietary cholesterol can have a small effect on cholesterol, the majority of what we make, more than 75%, we produce on our own. And also it's a dynamic system. We're constantly building cholesterol, breaking it down. So we can repurpose cholesterol from our diet and remake it into cholesterol that we need. And there's a lot of cholesterol transport and things like that. But really, when it comes down to it, it's not really cholesterol in toto that is the problem. We know that there is a particular type of cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, which we sometimes refer to as bad cholesterol, which is nonsense. Again, we absolutely need LDL cholesterol, but it turns out if we have excessive amounts of it, and particularly by using either a measurement called ApoB or LDLP, there's definitely a clear link between that and your risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, we talked about with you that you've got no family history. You don't have a lot of things that scream out cardiovascular risk. We've done, and if it's okay if I share that.
Share anything you want.
We got a calcium score that shows no calcification in the coronaries, which puts you at a very, very low risk.
Which is an ultrasound, right?
CT scan.
That's a CT scan that shows, right? And if somebody had something, it would measure it in some sort of square something or other.
That cholesterol plaque is an injury, and our body responds to injury by laying down calcium to try to protect it. We can detect that calcium with a very inexpensive, very quick test.
And by the way, remind me, I want to go back later about heart disease and what we know about what causes heart attacks and what doesn't. Because all the things you're going to hear today are the things that when we sat and talk, maybe a drink in our hand or just sitting down around a fire chatting, and he's telling me stuff, it's like, that's how it happens? It's like, this is like a takeoff on stuff you should know podcast, but the Orthopreneurs edition. So anyway, you were going back to cholesterol, sorry.
So those cholesterol numbers, our dietary cholesterol has a pretty minimal effect. And our cholesterol metabolism is based on a lot of other things. And remember, those cholesterol molecules, those LDL cholesterols, it's sort of like a sphere. And inside that sphere is cholesterol, but also triglycerides. And
do you want to go back and explain to them what you taught me about triglycerides? About how triglycerides are formed and what really is the basis? Because that was important for me.
Yeah, and so, triglycerides are really affected by insulin, okay? And so triglycerides are a way of us utilizing excess glucose, glucose that's in excess of our needs to store it for a rainy day. And we talked about being hunter-gatherers and be on the verge of starvation all the time. And our genes were sort of designed with this impending starvation model baked deep into our genetics.
Right. If we could kill an animal, we ate, we survived.
Right.
Like any other animal in the wild today, they kill an animal, they eat. They survive. If they don't kill an animal,
they don't.
They don't. And so we needed some sort of fat storage. So the excess glucose was through cholesterol, what have you, or the insulin spike turned into fat on our body so that we could at least survive if we didn't kill an animal tomorrow.
Exactly. And so we were hunter-gatherers, right? And if you are a hunter-gatherer with no technology and you come across a potential carbohydrate source like a field of berries or fruit trees or something like that, we couldn't really preserve those things. We might be able to carry a couple of them with us for a day or two, but we'd pretty much gorge ourselves, right? And so all of a sudden, we gorge ourselves with this carbohydrate-rich food, and we would digest that and we would get glucose out of it. And glucose is a little teeny tiny molecule, right? And so our bloodstream would fill up with glucose particles. Now, if we did nothing, what happens to little tiny particles in our bloodstream? Well, blood goes through the kidneys, we filter those things out, and we pee it out, get rid of it. Now, if that glucose is energy, right, and we are peeing it out, it's probably not a great survival adaptation. So God in his wisdom gave us this hormone called insulin. And insulin basically signals the cell to do a few different things. One of them is, it says to the cell, hey, those blood sugar, those glucose molecules that are floating through, pull them out, pull them inside. And now they're protected. They can't be filtered out of by the kidney if they're inside the cell. Now, cells can use glucose for energy. We store glucose in the form of glycogen, typically near the mitochondria.
The powerhouse of the cell. We all know that. The famous mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell.
Now, if those glucose stores, like glycogen stores, are sort of full, free-floating glucose is very reactive. It can bind to hemoglobin. It can cause kind of havoc in the cell. So instead, it sort of sets up this process where we convert glucose to glyceride, and then through some enzymes and hormones, or rather enzymes in the cell, we take 3 of those glyceride molecules, stick them on a backbone of other molecules.
We have 3 of them.
I got 3 of them, and we put it outside the cell, back into the bloodstream. And 3 glycerides are a
triglyceride.
Triglyceride. Now, it's a big molecule, too big to get filtered by the kidney, so it bypasses the kidney, gets to the liver typically, where it's packaged in a cholesterol molecule, typically LDL cholesterol, although HDL as well. And that cholesterol molecule then it goes throughout the body distributing cholesterol, or in the case of triglycerides, goes and stores it in adipose tissue. Right. So
if that doesn't disgust you, for those watching and not just listening, I am now holding the equivalent of 10 pounds of fat that they took out of my rear end yesterday. No, but this is 10 pounds of fat. If you're watching.
Right. But it's also 10 pounds of triglycerides.
Right.
It's 10 pounds of glucose. It's 10 pounds of energy. It's a battery. So now, if we don't kill an animal today and we've gorged ourselves, we got some of that, we can live for a little while longer until we can kill an animal. So it's a great survival adaptation. Now, flash forward 20,000 years, and all of a sudden we have McDonald's on every corner and a supermarket everywhere, and we're never in that sort of, that famine mode. But our genes haven't changed. And so when we get exposed to these especially highly processed carbohydrates that raise our blood sugar really high, and we're releasing lots of insulin. Well, when we're releasing a lot of insulin, what are we telling our body to do? Store energy for a rainy day. And we keep doing that, and thus we have this obesity epidemic. And, so it's our nutrition that drives a lot of this. And high levels of insulin are inflammatory, and they inflame blood vessels. They cause our blood pressure to go up. They start causing us to get abnormal amounts of LDL cholesterol, which is associated with cardiovascular disease. It lowers our HDL, our good cholesterol. It causes our waist to start expanding. Ultimately, we start having trouble maintaining our blood sugar because we get resistant to insulin, and our blood sugar goes up. And we talked about metabolic syndrome and sort of 5 criteria.
In the last episode.
Yeah.
Go through it one more time real quick.
Yeah,
if you don't
so
mind.
5 pieces of that. 1, high triglycerides. Makes sense, right? These are all signs of insulin resistance.
And the baseline for high triglyceride typically is
above
about?
150.
Okay.
2, low HDL, typically below 50 for females, below 40 for males. Waist size. Men
at the widest spot.
At the widest spot, above 40 inches. Women above 35 inches. A slight elevation of blood pressure. Blood pressure above 135/85, which is sort of technically normal. That gets you a point. And lastly, an elevated fasting blood sugar above 100. If 3 of 5, that gives you that meets the definition for metabolic syndrome. We think there might be 150 million Americans that have metabolic syndrome that have no idea. Increases your risk of diabetes to 1 in 3 in the next year. Increase your risk of cancer by 60%. Increase your risk of cardiovascular disease ultimately by 70%. So really not good.
Right.
And we want to fix that. But it all comes down to sort of this insulin connection, and cholesterol is tightly involved in it. But the long story short is that dietary cholesterol really isn't probably where we need to be focusing. We really need to be focusing on sort of our baseline physiology, what we're doing nutritionally overall in combination with all the other stuff that we looked at. Labs, hormones, supplements, fitness, nutrition, sleep, stress management, and then other
family history.
Exactly, other measurements of risk.
But at the end of the day, when somebody says, "Oh, hey Jeff, I have high cholesterol. I can't eat that steak," I wouldn't say it's laughable, but it's certainly not correct. Because chances are, as I've learned, if my cholesterol is getting a little bit high, a little bit, right? I'm at 350 or 400, but it's starting to get up there a little bit, and my A1C one might be a little bit high, and I don't have 3 or 4 or 5 of the factors that you talked about for the metabolic problems, but we should start chasing my insulin resistance before, well, not even before. We're never going to really worry a whole lot about my meat intake. It's going to be much more related to, like, how's my body not processing sugar properly, right? And creating triglycerides and creating all the stuff that's bad for me and managing it that way.
And that being said, I'm a pragmatist. I use those that we get so you saw how much data we've got. And we've got more data pending. We don't have your genetics back. We don't have your epigenetics.
That's why we can't give everybody listening all the details of everything, because we're still here. Now, if someone were to come in.
Yeah, and we generally are hopeful that it takes the genetics take 8 to 12 weeks to come back. Epigenetics take some time, but we're kind of scheduling out far enough that for a lot of people who are coming, we have all of that information. But we have Zoom, and so it's not hard to when it does report. But I'm not against a plant-based diet. I'm not, but I'll tell you, our most difficult weight loss patients are vegetarians.
The most difficult weight loss are vegetarians.
Right, because what do they eat? A lot of highly processed stuff, mainly. That being said, we really want to be eating good quality food. And I'm just not an absolutist. I'm not going to say you can never have meat. You can never have this, only eat this, because it sells books, it sells, clicks, whatever, but it's not realistic. And we have the ability to look at people on an individual basis and say, well, based on your labs, on your history, on your genetics, this probably is going to get us in the ballpark where this is going to probably be best for you. And what's best for you may not be what's best for me.
No, my wife and I both came here together. It's not uncommon for couples to come because, you can support each other on your health journey, because you want to be together hopefully the rest of your lives.
Right.
And if you were to look at me and my wife, if we were sitting there at the beach, her in a bikini, me in my swimsuit, and you looked at the two of us, you would think perhaps very differently about the results we found versus what we actually, and I'm not going to talk about her stuff because I don't want to, and she didn't get permission for that, and I don't want to do that to her. But the point is,
we can say, though, she's not over fat.
She's not over fat. She's actually really, really good in that respect. But the point is that there's no one size that fits all. And anybody who says only eat visceral organs, right? Only eat meat, only eat legumes, only.
And would you tell every single patient to do the exact same treatment plan?
Of course, that's how we roll. No, I'm kidding, but yeah. And at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that, for instance, if you want to go and say that Glenn needs to lose some visceral fat, right, which we'll get into how we know that in a minute, but I need to lose visceral fat, I need to lose some belly fat. Jeff is a big fan of 80-20, right? 80% of the time, make really good choices, and 20% of the time, live life, right? Enjoy life to some extent.
And we've had a 20% weekend.
Yeah, we have had a 20% weekend. 100% fun, 20% bad food. But when you're trying to lose that belly fat, when you're trying to get, it's kind of like a plane taking off. It takes a lot more energy effort. You can't go 80-20 and expect to lose the belly fat. You need to put in that effort, that time. But I want to jump now into a couple of other things because we're on that topic about, let's be honest, a lot of the people here listening want longevity, but I can look at you all day long and go, hey, I want you to live to 100 in great shape. That doesn't motivate you the same as you've got a trip coming up in 8 weeks and you want to look good on the beach, right? And so let's talk a little bit about if I wanted to lose weight, right? I know at my age at 55, losing weight is way more difficult even though belly fat, we're going to sort of work on ways, you're going to give me a blueprint, if you will, on how to attack my belly fat, because that's what I need, as opposed to if I need to put on muscle mass,
Right.
which you can learn along the way as well. My question for you is, we've heard about some of the tools and sort of hacks that are out there to help me lose some weight faster. What are some of the things that you sometimes bring into the conversation in terms of medications or supplements or things like that that help people who are moving through this?
Right. So, for example, one of the things we checked with you is this hormone called leptin. And we found in you that your leptin levels are high. So you're leptin resistant. So if we can improve leptin sensitivity, it's going to drive fat loss and also, kind of help us achieve our goals. How do we do that? Well, we talked about intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is not a bad way of resetting leptin levels. Now, you're already kind of doing it,
right,
yet our leptin levels are a little high. So, maybe intermittent fasting is not working so well. But, we do have tools, medications, supplements that we can do. Some of the supplements we use, we have a supplement that basically improves leptin sensitivity and ghrelin sensitivity. And so that's one technique. We can use medications, things like metformin or GLP-1 agonists. And, we've been using GLP-1 agonists here for 2 years now, but now it's, Ozempic and Wegovy.
Can you do that in like English, what a GLP-1?
Yeah, so a GLP-1 agonist is basically it's a medication that does sort of three things. And you've probably heard of Wegovy or Ozempic, like all the Hollywood people are using it. It's suddenly like the hottest thing. Well, we've been doing it for a long time because the physiology makes a lot of sense. GLP-1 essentially is that receptor drives a couple things, and it does sort of a number of things that are very helpful for weight loss. For one, it improves insulin sensitivity. So if we're insulin resistant, we've got metabolic syndrome, our fasting insulin levels are high, it helps us respond to glucose loads with less insulin. So if normally I'm supposed to release, I get this carbohydrate load and I'm supposed to release this much insulin, when I'm insulin resistant, I'm releasing this much, right? And metformin and GLP-1 agonists and other things we do tend to improve insulin sensitivity. So again, we're back down to here. We normalize that. We've used metformin for weight loss for a dozen years because it does a nice job of that. But GLP-1s are a little bit better because they do a couple other things. Centrally, they improve satiety. So when you're taking a GLP-1 agonist, you feel full faster. But also, they decrease gastric emptying and decrease GI motility. So you empty your stomach slower and you stay fuller for longer. So that combination of things, but also GLP-1 also has an effect on leptin. And so it lowers leptin resistance as well.
And what is leptin, just so we can all be on the same page?
Yeah, so leptin is a hormone that gets released basically by the small intestine in the stomach when you eat. So if I'm starving and I eat a cheeseburger or a hamburger, as that food hits my stomach, the stomach distends a little bit. And in response to that, I start releasing leptin. And leptin goes back to the brain and says, hey, you know what? We're not starving anymore. The stomach is starting to fill up. Let's turn the appetite down because we're kind of being fed now. And also, because we're not starving and we're being fed, it's okay to use fat for energy. So it's a double, right? So we get this increased satiety, and we also kind of get free rein to burn fat, which is what we want to do. So being sensitive to leptin is a very important thing. Now they try to make leptin a drug. Sounds like a great idea, right?
Sounds awesome.
It's going to decrease my appetite. I'm going to burn more fat.
Inject it right on my love handles.
Exactly.
And there's no love in those love handles.
No love at all.
Yeah.
But they did that. What happened? Nothing. And then they started, measuring leptin levels, and people were very obese. Guess what? Their leptin levels are through the roof because just like you can be insulin resistant, you become leptin resistant, you don't respond at all. So if we can improve that or restore that sensitivity, we can do that. So there's lots of biohacks, supplements that we know, like conjugated linoleic acid, for example, that drives fat loss. It's all based in science. Like we have tons of, we're always looking at the latest studies, but we use all of these little tools to try to biohack people to where they want to be. So we want to, like I said, we want to be able to cheat in a safe way.
Right.
And if we can cheat, let's cheat.
Right.
I'm a huge believer. I've had people say, well, that's not fair what you're doing.
Fair to who?
Like, it's fair to, well, you know, these people are coming in and you're doing all this stuff and they're going to live longer. Well, the average person
How dare
can't do
you?
that. I'm like, yeah, I know. The average person, you know, can't drive a Ferrari, you know, either. Like, but, you know, if you have if you really want to, like, you could probably, no matter what you do, you could probably afford a Ferrari at some point if you really, really focus on that thing. And so for longevity, you're probably not going to get like what you need from your regular doctor because they don't have time. Not that they don't want to do it. They just don't have time to get into the weeds and say, listen, I want to live to be 95 and be fit and be mentally sharp. What is your doctor going to tell you?
Eat well, exercise.
Yeah.
Just come and see me once a year, get your bloods drawn, try to eat a balanced diet, get lots of vegetables. And we're going to get into the food pyramid in just a minute.
Right.
We're going to get there. So I'm just going to pull us away from that just for a second because I think, you know, a lot of us out there say, well, I can do this on my own. I just give me a great diet. I don't want to get on meds. Number one, the GLP-1 agonists are not forever, right?
Yeah.
They're meant to get you
not
through.
For everybody.
But let's assume they are. Let's assume they're perfect for me, which it sounds like they may be. I'm not going on it for the next 50 years. I'm going on it for what, like a 17?
Well, we're, you know, like if we were to use a GLP-1.
And let's not talk about me specifically. Talk about anybody.
You know, we have goals, right? And like when we did your DEXA scan, we said, well, listen, you know, the average male at your age, 25% body fat is normal on DEXA at your age. But optimal is probably 15 to 20, like in that range. So do you mind if I say we're at about 30?
Yeah.
And we need to get
I'm
you
over fat.
Over fat, right? And so we need to get you really.
By the way, I want
20.
to dispute. I am not accepting the results of this test. I believe we need a recount.
Okay. Well, you know what? Well, next time we'll do a recount, and I'm sure
It'll be lower.
I will be wrong.
Yes.
You will not be over.
And while we're on the topic, I want to come back to that in a second because I want to stop with me being over fat. That's where we'll come back to because it's a great topic. I'm never going to hear the end of it from people. But I got on your two other really expensive body fat, and those watching see me in air quotes, body fat analysis scales. Right. And I won't name the name brand, but I have a really nice, expensive one that I hold two handles at home. And I will tell you that it always told me I was between 19.5% and 21.5% body fat. I get on the ones you have here. One says 24.5, one's about 23.5, somewhere around that range. I then do a DEXA scan, which is the gold standard, right? That is the gold standard.
Yeah.
And I'm at 30.5, somewhere in that range. And so we're seeing a monstrous 10-degree swing between the expensive scale I have at home and your super expensive machines here, for which we were using just for basic weight and other things. Right. And so number one, do you mind explaining to people, once you understand what a DEXA scan is, if you guys don't understand it, he's going to explain it to you. And the fact that when people come up to me and go, yeah, I'm 13% body fat, I'm 14% body fat, I'm willing to wager if they're doing it at home, they're not 13 or 14% body fat. And so if you want to explain what a DEXA scan is first and why it's more accurate, and we do agree that the scales at home might be very precise but not very accurate, right? They're giving the same reading in the same range and they might be off by the same magnitude.
And we have to understand our technology. So the devices that we have tinnitus, you know, people have in-bodies or whatever, that's all bioimpedance, and they're all use the same technology. They're basically measuring a charge. That you stand on these metal pads, you're holding onto these handles, and you're measuring basically impedance between your feet and your hand, your foot and your other foot, your hand and your hand, and it's calculating body fat. Okay. The problem is it's a calculation, and those calculations are affected very significantly by the amount of water. So your impedance is going to change the more hydrated you are. And when we have new staff members, one of the things we do is we put them on those expensive, you know, those things are $10,000, $20,000 BIA scales.
They look, if people were, when they come here and they see it, they're big.
And, you know, I'll have our new employees get on in the morning, again in the afternoon, again in the evening. And we'll have swings in body fat percentage of 4 to 6% during the course of a day.
Wow.
So
that's a big lunch.
Now, there are techniques you can do to sort of make if you can measure in the same way every time, like get up in the morning, pee, get on it, then you start getting a little bit better. But also, when you look at each device, it'll sort of give you a range of what's normal. And they all market the same way. as good as
a DEXA.
DEXA.
And that's when I bought the one I had. And by the way, as an aside, when I was getting my 19.5 to 21.5, it certainly was based on what I ate or didn't eat. But every morning, got up, peed, got on it was the same every day, and still I'm 10% off.
But if you look at the chart that comes with your particular, it might say that optimal might be 15% food on that. So it may not be, so that percentage is sort of based on the technology. So it's hard to compare apples to oranges. The DEXA is the gold standard because it is a direct measurement. It measures density, right? And so it measures density of three things: bone, which is obviously one density; fat, which is another density; and lean tissue. And lean tissue is muscle and organ. So muscle and organ have about the same density. So there's our 10 pounds of muscle.
If you're watching, this is a 10-pound steak waiting to be eaten.
There you go. If you get it, if you eat it in an hour, it's free.
That's the old 96er.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, we're measuring density. And so we get a very accurate measure of how many pounds of fat you have, how many pounds of lean mass, how many pounds of bone. And if you look at the original studies they did with DEXA for body composition, they actually took animal carcasses, measured it, and then they dissected, and they had a pile of bones and a pile of fat, and they're like, oh, it correlates very well.
And by the way, just to tell people who don't know, what is a DEXA? I know, obviously, because I've been through it. Yeah. But what is a DEXA scan?
It's dual energy X-ray absorption, which basically uses a very low amount of X-ray. It's 1/100th of a chest X-ray.
So you're laying on a table.
And it's got a little arm, and we've got a video of it, right?
Okay.
I think that we
Somewhere.
filmed that, yeah.
Yeah, it'll come out when I do it.
And we can do bone density and body composition.
And you sit still for basically about 5 minutes.
Right.
You sit there 5 minutes, and it goes over your whole body, and then it gives you, which I'll try to show, when I show the next thing, it gives you a map of red and blue and white so you can see where your muscle is, where the fat is, and then it does a measurement of all of that. And that is by far the most accurate reading if you want to know precisely what your body fat was.
I mean, you can argue that there's an MRI that's a little bit more, but we're talking about $2,000 versus, very inexpensive.
And I found out that I have 7 pounds of bone.
Yeah.
Right? Like that to me, my wife and I were both like, wow, that's all the bones in your body only weigh 7 pounds. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Right. And it also calculates, if you were to have 0% body fat, you'd be dead.
Right. I'll tell you what your fat-free mass is. So,
right.
And we can use that to sort of, in a rough way, say, hey, optimal weight, we could put you here.
Right.
What we typically find is it's nowhere near what you're supposed to be on the chart. All the time. I've got people that on those charts, this would be 140 pounds and their fat-free mass is 155. So the only way to get there would be to lose a ton of muscle.
Which is another conversation.
Right. And the other thing we can do is we can tell you what your visceral fat is. And the visceral fat is that dangerous fat that's inside the abdominal cavity around the organs that's very tightly associated with metabolic disease, cancer risk, stroke risk, heart attack risk. We can measure that.
Everybody get what you can out of Orthopreneurs now, because I think there's a chance based on, Jeff is making me realize that get everything download every episode this minute, there may not be another.
No, we're going to make sure that there's thousands more.
Yeah.
But the other thing it will give us is what's called the relative skeletal muscle index, which basically is a calculation. I mentioned lean was muscle and organs both. Well, so if I just measure your lean mass, maybe your liver is bigger than mine or my spleen, so that's maybe not the best way to compare. But if we just look at the extremities, there's no organs in the extremities. So if we just take the lean mass in the extremity, we can give people this relative skeletal muscle index. And it's a calculation based on your height, but you basically get a number. And
my right arm is 13 pounds, by the way.
But we figured that you were, I think, if I remember right, you were in the 60th percentile for relative skeletal muscle index?
I don't recall.
We want you above the 50th percentile, ideally above the 70th percentile, because lean mass and VO2 max are probably the two most important, most impactful things on longevity. If you quit smoking, it, improves your mortality by 50%, lower,
I heard it was 7 years. You just added 7 years to your life or something like that.
If you enter your 70s at a relative skeletal muscle index of the 70th percentile or higher, it's a 450% improvement in longevity.
Wow. So say that again, if you enter your 70s.
With really good muscle mass, your longevity is improved by 450%.
So, and would that back up the fact that I keep telling my friends who are my age, hey, stop doing HIIT workouts nonstop. Get some muscle on your body. And I tell it to all my younger friends who are in their 20s, 30s. I'm like, get some muscle mass now, because when you hit my age, it's a lot tougher to put on.
Yeah. And one of the biggest determinants of aging is what we call sarcopenia, where people are losing muscle mass. And when you see that frail old person that's like, they don't have Parkinson's. That's not why they're frail and unsteady. They don't have any core strength. They don't have any muscle mass. And that's why they fall. And that's probably what drives that loss of longevity. But sarcopenia, and how do we build, healthy 70-year-olds? We start with 50, 30, 40, 50-year-olds.
Right.
And DEXA gives us that information. The other important thing about DEXA is that we get serial measurements and we can trend it. So we can say, oh, look. And my big thing is, what's the delta? So our typical male patient has a 20-pound delta at 3 months.
Between when they walked in your door
and 3 months later.
And when they come back or get checked through remote 3 months later.
So that delta is pounds of fat lost plus pounds of muscle gained. So some people might come in at 170 pounds and come in 3 months later, be 170 pounds. We scan them, they've dropped 10 pounds of fat, gained 10 pounds of muscle. They just dropped their body fat percentage pretty significantly. They didn't change their weight at all. Sometimes we have guys that come in that are pretty fit to begin with, and they come in 3 months later, they're 15 pounds heavier. They've lost, basically their body fat was pretty good, but they've gained 15 pounds of muscle, or some combination of that. So,
and how are they doing this? Like, again, so for people listening, we all want to live longer. We all want to be healthier.
Right.
We don't necessarily want to put the time and energy and effort into living longer, but I hear the stories, and you've told me many, many times how people come in, they lose weight, they gain muscle mass, and I've seen it with me and my wife, because you've given, we haven't gone through our final sort of blueprint, but you've given different ideas to her and to me about recipes for longevity, because one might have more fat, one might have more muscle, what have you. But how successful are you with people walking through the door? How engaged does someone need to be able, is it like, it's homework you got to do?
Right. I'm not successful at all.
Well, no, okay.
Yeah,
right.
And we talked about how sometimes we've had people come in that we just have declined to work with because, you've got to do the work, right? I always tell people I can't make it easy, right? But I can make it simple. And most of us can handle simple.
Right.
And again, we talked about a little bit earlier, if we start out maybe not where we want to be, then we've got to be strict for some period of time. But you don't have to be there forever. I think I gave you this example. If your favorite food in the entire world is your mother's chocolate chip cookies, and I say, Glenn, listen, I've got a perfect recipe for you to live forever. Just never eat those cookies again. What's the chance, realistically, of that happening?
Right.
It's not going to happen. But if I say, listen, Glenn, we got to do some improvements here. So for the next couple months, I don't want you to have any of your mom's cookies, but we'll get you to a point where you can have them again. In some, that's that 80-20 idea. We get people where they need to be. Once we get them there, live that lifestyle 80% of the time, 20% of the time, do whatever you do. And if you think about that, we went out this weekend with
we didn't go anywhere.
We didn't go anywhere with our good friend, and we had a perfectly clean meal last night, right?
Well, the truth of the matter is, if you looked at what we did, and the funny part about it is there's clean, there's not so clean, and then there's really bad.
Right.
Right? Like what we did yesterday, we had fruits and egg and plantains.
Plantains,
yeah. Your wife made a beautiful Dominican breakfast, right? But we had that to start.
Because I have a beautiful Dominican wife.
Yes, she has a lovely wife who's a great cook. But it was lots of great fruits and what have you. You can make the argument, well, the plantains have a little bit of sugar in them, starchy, but overall, it may not be the cleanest, but it's clean enough.
Right.
And then for lunch, I had a salad with some salmon in it. Maybe a little extra dressing, but it's still pretty clean. And then for dinner, what did I have? I had a piece of salmon with some vegetables, a couple of tortilla chips with it, which isn't so bad. We had a couple of drinks, which isn't great, and that's when it all unraveled, is when our friend who owns a restaurant decided to bring out all the desserts, literally.
Every day.
Every dessert they have. And when you've driven 2 hours to get to his restaurant and he brings out 4 desserts, we made it relatively very unclean.
Yeah, at the end.
Right, at the very end. But my point is, you can live within a pretty normal, sustainable lifestyle by saying, I'm going to go out with my wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whomever, significant other tonight, and we're going to have a pretty good meal, but I'm not going to order the fries as an appetizer. I'm not going to order fish and chips for the main meal. I'm not going to have 4 drinks and add, a full dessert to the end of it, right? And even there, you can do that.
But also, we talked about how, realistically, it's not those meals that get you.
No.
Because how many times are we going to do that in a month?
Right. 3-4 times a month.
It's that lunch we have at work or we're by ourselves that happens, 20 times a week during the work week, or 20 times a month, 30 times a month if you throw in the rest of the month. That breakfast, like there's lots of opportunity on these routine, mundane meals. Like if you screw up every one of those,
that's a problem.
That's a problem. That's 60 hits versus like, oh, I'm going to go out for 2, dinners with friends this month, and I'm, gonna. It's a little bit like the stub toe analogy I said to you. You stub your toe. It's like the worst thing in the world for a few minutes, and then like 2 hours later, you remember that you stubbed your toe. No, but if I take a hammer and I just keep banging that toe over and over, it's going to cause problems.
Right.
So we can deal with a stubbed toe, and that's really the mindset. Like you don't have to be perfect. What we want to be is pretty good, but we want to kind of line things up so they're great. We have a base of, we know it's really good for us, and then we can deviate a little bit of that in a smart, reasonable fashion.
And then when you're trying to lose the weight, you got to be more strict. I mean, nothing comes for nothing. But the agonist stuff, the drugs that you can give, the supplements, they're going to make it a little bit easier. Like we talked about studying for an exam. You want to get a 95. You might get there on your own, but if I said I can give you a little pill that's going to help you study a little bit, you don't have to study quite as hard.
Yeah, I'm not giving you the answers.
But you still got to study, but you don't have to study quite as hard. Take this. It's legal. You're not going to get in trouble for it. Just take it. It's not going to hurt you in any way. And you know what? You'll get your 95, but you'll do it with a little less effort. And you'll get there a little bit faster. It's a wonderful thing. And we talked about the fact that 80-20 rule is that once you get there, if there's, say, 5 meals a day, you include a breakfast, a lunch, a dinner, a couple of snacks during the day, you do that for 30 days in a month, that's 150 meals a month, right? What's 20% of 150? 30. So you eat 120 of them clean, and 30 of them, you have a little cheat going on.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're going in and eating an entire pizza, like you have to be mindful, but even if you did that once a month or twice a month, it's not going to throw your numbers off